The fastest way to lose someone is to stop questioning the people who benefit from turning you against them. My name is Emily Parker, and looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact day my husband stopped looking at me the same way. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Nothing dramatic. No argument. No crisis. Just a phone call. Michael and I had been married for nearly 17 years. Like any couple, we had disagreements, but we always found our way back to each other. At least that was what I believed. That afternoon, I came home from work carrying groceries and thinking about dinner. Michael was sitting at the kitchen table staring at his phone. The moment I walked into the room, he looked up at me, but something felt different. His smile seemed forced. His eyes lingered on me for a second too long, almost as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied quickly. Too quickly. Then he looked back down at his phone. I remember standing there feeling a strange knot form in my stomach. Over the next few days, the feeling only grew stronger. Michael became distant in subtle ways. He still went to work. He still came home every evening. He still asked how my day was. Yet something underneath those routines had shifted. Conversations felt shorter. His responses felt cautious. Sometimes I would catch him studying me when he thought I was not paying attention. Whenever I asked if something was wrong, he would insist everything was fine. One Saturday morning, we were having coffee on the back patio when his phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw Patricia's name. His mother. Michael answered immediately. I tried not to listen, but her voice carried through the speaker louder than she probably realized. I heard my name. Then I heard it again. When the call ended, Michael sat quietly for several moments. "What was that about?" I asked. He shrugged. "Nothing important." The answer felt rehearsed. Over the following weeks, similar calls became more frequent. Every time Patricia called, Michael seemed to withdraw a little further from me afterward. Small misunderstandings began appearing out of nowhere. One evening he asked why I was upset with his mother. The question stunned me because I was not upset with her. Another time he mentioned that I apparently did not want to attend a family gathering. I had never said that. At first I assumed there had been some simple confusion. Maybe Patricia misunderstood something I said. Maybe Michael heard part of a conversation and filled in the blanks incorrectly. But eventually the pattern became impossible to ignore. These were not random misunderstandings. Someone was telling a story about me that I did not recognize. The most painful part was not what Patricia might have been saying. It was watching Michael slowly accept those stories without ever asking whether they were true. And as I stood in my own kitchen one evening watching him scroll through messages with a troubled expression on his face, I realized a frightening possibility. Whatever his mother had been telling him, he was starting to believe it. Over the next month, the situation became increasingly difficult to ignore. At first, I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Patricia and I had never been especially close, but we had always been civil. I could not understand why she would suddenly start creating tension between her son and me. Yet every week brought another strange conversation. One evening Michael came home from work and asked why I thought his mother was becoming a burden to the family. The question caught me completely off guard. I stared at him in disbelief. "I never said that," I replied. Michael frowned. "Mom said you mentioned it during lunch last week." The problem was that I had not had lunch with Patricia the previous week. In fact, I had not seen her in nearly 3 weeks. When I pointed that out, Michael looked confused for a moment before quickly changing the subject. That should have been the end of it. Instead, similar situations continued happening. Patricia claimed I was frustrated about helping with family events. Patricia claimed I did not enjoy visiting relatives. Patricia claimed I believed she interfered too much in our lives. Some of those accusations contained small pieces of truth twisted into something unrecognizable. Others were completely fabricated. The most unsettling part was how naturally Michael accepted them. He never seemed angry. He never raised his voice. But each new accusation created another small crack in the trust between us. One Saturday afternoon, Patricia invited us to her house for lunch. I agreed because I was tired of feeling like an outsider in conversations that seemed to revolve around me. During the meal, she acted perfectly pleasant. She complimented my cooking, asked about work, smiled warmly whenever Michael spoke. Watching her, I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. Then, while Michael stepped outside to answer a phone call, Patricia looked directly at me and said something that immediately changed the atmosphere. "You know, Emily, people often reveal who they really are without realizing it." Her tone remained light, but her eyes told a different story. I felt a chill run through me. What does that mean? I asked. She smiled politely and took a sip of iced tea. Nothing important. Just an observation. Before I could respond, Michael returned and the conversation shifted. Yet the comment stayed with me long after we left. Driving home that evening, I watched Michael staring out the passenger window. He seemed distracted, thoughtful, almost troubled. For the first time, I began wondering how many private conversations were taking place when I was not around. How many stories had Patricia told? How many assumptions had already formed in Michael's mind? That night, as I lay awake beside my husband, I realized something painful. I was no longer fighting a misunderstanding. I was fighting a version of myself that someone else had created. And little by little, the man I loved was starting to believe it. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday evening. Michael and I were sitting in the living room after dinner when he suddenly muted the television and turned toward me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger. It was disappointment. Somehow that felt worse. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. Of course. He hesitated before speaking. "Why do you keep talking about my mother behind her back?" For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood the question. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Michael leaned forward. "Mom says you have been telling people she manipulates me. She says you have been complaining about her for months." I stared at him in disbelief. "That is not true." His jaw tightened slightly. "She would not make something like that up." The sentence landed harder than he probably realized. Not because of what he said about Patricia, because of what it revealed about me. After 17 years of marriage, my husband found his mother's version of events more believable than mine. "Did you ask for any proof?" I asked quietly. Michael looked frustrated. Why would she need proof? I could feel my heart sinking. The conversation was no longer about facts. It was about trust, or more accurately, the absence of it. "Michael," I said carefully, "you are accusing me of things I did not do." He rubbed his forehead. "I am not accusing you. I am trying to understand why there are so many problems lately." There it was again. Every road somehow led back to me. Every misunderstanding. Every conflict. Every uncomfortable family moment. Patricia presented herself as the concerned mother trying to keep peace while I slowly became the source of tension. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Over the following days, similar conversations continued. Sometimes they were subtle, sometimes direct. Michael questioned comments I never made, opinions I never expressed, conversations that never happened. Each time I denied them, he seemed uncertain rather than convinced. It felt as though I was constantly defending myself against invisible accusations. One Sunday afternoon, we attended a family birthday gathering. Throughout the event, I noticed something unusual. Several relatives behaved differently around me. Nothing obvious, just small things. Awkward pauses, curious glances, conversations that stopped when I approached. By the time we drove home, I felt emotionally exhausted. "Did you notice anything strange today?" I asked. Michael kept his eyes on the road. "Not really." I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. For the first time, I realized Patricia's stories might not be limited to private conversations with her son. The possibility unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Later that night, I stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes while Michael prepared for bed upstairs. The house was quiet except for the sound of running water. As I stared at my reflection in the dark window above the sink, a painful realization settled over me. I had spent weeks trying to correct false information, weeks trying to defend myself against stories I never created. Yet no amount of explanation seemed to matter, because the real problem was no longer Patricia's words. The real problem was that Michael had already decided whose voice he trusted most. And for the first time since our marriage began, I was not sure it was mine. After that evening, I stopped focusing on the accusations themselves and started paying attention to the pattern behind them. Once I did, I began noticing things that had escaped me for years. Patricia rarely told obvious lies. That was what made her so effective. Instead, she took small pieces of truth and reshaped them into something completely different. Looking back, I realized she had been doing it long before the recent problems began. I remembered a family barbecue from several years earlier. I had mentioned feeling overwhelmed at work during a particularly stressful project. A week later, Michael told me his mother was concerned because I apparently hated my job and wanted to quit. That was not what I said. Another time, I declined an invitation because I had promised to help a friend who was recovering from surgery. Somehow the story became that I preferred spending time with strangers instead of family. At the time, I dismissed these incidents as misunderstandings. Now they looked very different. One evening after work, I found myself sitting alone in the driveway for nearly 15 minutes before going inside. I was not avoiding my home. I was trying to understand how things had reached this point. The answer was uncomfortable. Patricia had spent years controlling the narrative while I spent years giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. The more I reflected, the more examples surfaced. Small comments, half-truths, convenient omissions. Individually, none of them seemed serious. Together, they created an entirely different picture of who I was. And somehow that picture had become more believable than reality. The following weekend, Michael and I attended another family gathering. As usual, Patricia played the role of the caring mother perfectly. She greeted everyone warmly, asked thoughtful questions, shared stories that made people laugh. Watching her interact with relatives, I finally understood why challenging her felt nearly impossible. She never appeared hostile. She never seemed malicious. To everyone else, she looked kind and concerned. Yet somehow, I always ended up cast as the difficult one. During dinner, a relative mentioned an upcoming family trip. Before I could respond, Patricia smiled and said, "Emily probably will not want to go. She usually prefers staying away from these things." Several people laughed politely. I forced a smile, but inside I felt stunned. I had never once said I did not want to attend. In fact, I enjoyed most family events. The statement was small enough to pass unnoticed. Yet it reinforced a false image that already existed. On the drive home, I brought it up to Michael. "Did you hear what your mother said?" I asked. He shrugged. She was just joking. That response hurt more than Patricia's comment. Not because I expected him to challenge her publicly, because he never seemed curious about whether her version of events was accurate. Every explanation ended the same way. Every concern was dismissed. Every conversation somehow protected Patricia from scrutiny. That night, as I sat in the living room after Michael went upstairs, I finally accepted something I had resisted for months. The problem was bigger than his mother's stories. The problem was that nobody was asking whether those stories were true. And until that changed, I would always be fighting an invisible battle against a version of myself that never actually existed. Something changed inside me after that realization. For months, I had been trying to correct every false statement, answer every accusation, and defend every part of my character. I thought if I explained things clearly enough, eventually Michael would understand. But understanding requires a willingness to listen, and I was beginning to see that no amount of explanation could compete with a story someone had already chosen to believe. So I stopped trying, not out of anger, not out of defeat. I simply became tired of participating in conversations where the outcome had already been decided. The first time Michael noticed the difference was during dinner one evening. He mentioned another comment his mother claimed I had made. Normally, I would have immediately explained why it was untrue. Instead, I quietly continued eating. After a moment, he looked at me. "You are not going to say anything?" he asked. I set down my fork. "I have said the same thing every time." "I did not say it." Michael frowned. "That is all." I nodded. "That is all." The conversation ended there, but I could tell he found my reaction unsettling. For years, I had worked hard to defend myself. Now I was refusing to play the role everyone expected. As the weeks passed, I focused more on my own life. I spent time with friends. I returned to hobbies I had neglected. I took long walks after work and listened to podcasts instead of replaying family conflicts in my head. Slowly, I began noticing how much energy I had wasted trying to manage other people's perceptions. One Saturday morning, I met an old friend for coffee. We had not seen each other in several months. As we talked, she asked how things were going at home. I surprised myself by answering honestly. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just honestly. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment and asked a simple question. "Why do you keep trying to convince people who are not trying to understand you?" I did not have an answer. The question followed me home that afternoon. That evening, Michael mentioned another upcoming family event. In the past, I would have immediately worried about how Patricia might portray me or what misunderstandings might occur. This time, I simply said I would think about it. My calmness seemed to confuse him. The harder I tried before, the less anyone listened. Now that I had stepped back, people seemed to notice the silence I left behind. Patricia continued telling her stories. Michael continued listening. Yet something about the situation was beginning to shift. Without constant arguments to distract from the real issue, the pattern became easier to see. Every accusation came from the same source. Every misunderstanding followed the same path. Every conflict somehow benefited the same person. One evening, as I sat alone on the back patio watching the sun disappear behind the trees, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The problems around me had not disappeared. Patricia had not changed. Michael had not changed. But for the first time in months, I had stopped measuring my worth by whether someone else believed me. And although I did not realize it then, that decision would eventually change everything. As spring approached, the atmosphere inside our home felt noticeably different. There were no dramatic arguments and no emotional confrontations. In many ways, the silence had become the loudest part of our marriage. Michael and I still shared the same house, but the easy connection we once enjoyed seemed increasingly distant. What surprised me most was that the distance no longer frightened me. For months, I had been working tirelessly to repair something that I could not fix alone. Now I was beginning to understand that trust cannot survive when only one person is carrying its weight. One evening, Michael came into the kitchen while I was preparing dinner. He stood there for a moment as if he wanted to say something important. Finally, he asked why I seemed so calm lately. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked. He leaned against the counter and shrugged. "You do not argue anymore. You do not defend yourself. You barely react when Mom says something." I thought about that for a moment. "Maybe I am tired," I replied. The answer was true, but it was not the whole truth. What I did not say was that I had reached a point where defending myself felt pointless. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Patricia made a claim. Michael repeated it. I denied it. Nothing changed. Eventually, I realized that constantly fighting for credibility was only exhausting me. A few days later, another incident occurred that revealed just how much trust had disappeared. Michael asked whether I had intentionally excluded his mother from plans for an upcoming family celebration. Once again, it was an accusation based on something I had never done. But this time, instead of explaining myself, I asked a question. "Did you ask me before assuming it was true?" Michael opened his mouth, then stopped. For several seconds, he said nothing. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument. That brief moment told me more than words ever could. He had not asked. He had simply accepted the information as fact. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room reflecting on everything that had happened over the previous year. The pattern was undeniable. Patricia's stories were not damaging our marriage by themselves. They were only succeeding because they were being accepted without question. That realization changed something fundamental inside me. For the first time, I stopped viewing myself as the problem that needed solving. Around the same time, I began making small decisions that focused on my own future. Nothing dramatic. I opened a separate savings account. I updated personal records. I spent more time reconnecting with friends I had neglected. Each step was practical and reasonable, yet together they created a growing sense of independence. I was not planning to leave, at least not yet, but I was preparing myself for the possibility that things might never improve. One Sunday afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the living room windows, Michael received another call from Patricia. I watched him listen quietly for nearly 20 minutes. When the call ended, he looked troubled. For the first time, however, he did not immediately come to me with questions or accusations. Instead, he sat silently staring at the floor. And as I watched him from across the room, I had the unmistakable feeling that something was beginning to shift beneath the surface, even if neither of us fully understood it yet. The turning point arrived on an ordinary Wednesday evening, and if I had not been standing in the room when it happened, I might never have believed it. Michael was sitting in his home office reviewing paperwork while I folded laundry in the bedroom. Everything felt routine until I heard his phone vibrate several times in rapid succession. A few moments later, I noticed him become unusually still. At first, I thought it was another conversation with Patricia. Then several minutes passed without a word. Eventually, I walked past the office and saw him staring at his phone screen with an expression I could not immediately recognize. He looked confused. More than that, he looked unsettled. When he noticed me, he quickly lowered the phone. Normally, I would have asked what was wrong. This time, I simply continued walking. About an hour later, he found me in the kitchen. "Emily," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" There was something different in his voice. Less certainty, more hesitation. I nodded. Michael looked uncomfortable. "A few months ago, Did you ever tell my cousin Rachel that you wanted to avoid family gatherings because of my mother? The question sounded familiar because it was one of Patricia's favorite accusations. No, I replied calmly. I never said that. Instead of arguing, Michael nodded slowly. Then he surprised me. That is what Rachel said too. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My heart skipped slightly. It was the first time in nearly a year that someone else's version of events had challenged Patricia's. Michael sat down at the kitchen table. He looked exhausted. Finally, he explained what had happened. Earlier that afternoon, Rachel accidentally forwarded him a conversation she thought he had already seen. The message contained screenshots from several months earlier. What caught Michael's attention was not one specific statement. It was the pattern. In multiple conversations, Patricia repeated stories about me that were dramatically different from what other relatives remembered. Some details changed depending on the audience. Some events were described in completely contradictory ways. For the first time, Michael was looking at the information all at once rather than one accusation at a time. The effect was impossible to ignore. As he spoke, I remained quiet. Not because I lacked opinions, because I knew this moment could not be forced. Michael needed to reach his own conclusions. The next few days felt different. He became unusually thoughtful. Several times I caught him reviewing old text messages, looking through emails, revisiting conversations that had once seemed insignificant. The more he examined the past, the more inconsistencies he discovered. Little details that never made sense. Stories that changed over time. Claims that could not possibly be true. One evening, I found him sitting alone on the back patio long after sunset. He looked up as I approached. I think I missed a lot, he admitted quietly. It was the first honest statement I had heard from him in months. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, just realization. As I sat across from him beneath the porch light, I sensed something important unfolding. The lies themselves were not new. They had existed for years. What was new was that someone was finally examining them. And once that process began, the version of reality Patricia had carefully constructed for so long was starting to crack in ways neither of us could stop. Over the following 2 weeks, the atmosphere in our home changed more dramatically than it had during the entire previous year. Not because anyone was arguing. Not because there were emotional confrontations. The change came from something much simpler. Michael had started asking questions. For years, Patricia's statements had moved through our family without challenge. Now, for the first time, he was examining them. The results were impossible to ignore. One evening, Michael came home carrying a folder filled with printed emails and notes. He sat at the dining room table for nearly an hour reviewing conversations from the past several years. Occasionally, he would stop and stare at a particular page as though seeing it for the first time. I did not interrupt. This was a process he needed to complete on his own. Several days later, he asked if we could talk. We sat together in the living room where so many uncomfortable conversations had taken place before. This time felt different. Michael looked exhausted. I have been comparing stories, he said quietly, and they do not match. I remained silent. He continued. Mom told me certain relatives were upset with you. When I asked them directly, they said they never said those things. Some of them were shocked when I repeated the stories. The sadness in his voice was unmistakable. It was the sound of someone watching a belief system collapse. Over the next week, more pieces fell into place. Michael discovered multiple situations where Patricia had presented assumptions as facts. Private opinions became public statements. Small frustrations became personal attacks. Ordinary disagreements became evidence of disloyalty. None of the individual stories seemed enormous by themselves. Yet together they formed a pattern that could no longer be explained away. One Saturday afternoon, Michael finally met with Patricia. I was not present for the conversation, but I knew it was happening. He left the house shortly after lunch and did not return until evening. When he walked through the front door several hours later, he looked emotionally drained. We sat quietly in the kitchen while the sun disappeared outside the windows. Finally, he spoke. She admitted some of it. The words hung in the air between us. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep sadness. Michael explained that Patricia initially defended herself by claiming she was protecting him, protecting the family, protecting relationships. But as specific examples emerged, those explanations became harder to maintain. Eventually, she acknowledged exaggerating conversations, filling in details, assuming motives, presenting assumptions as truths. Listening to him, I realized the most painful part was not learning what Patricia had done. The most painful part was seeing what it had cost. Months of tension, years of trust slowly eroded. A marriage damaged not by one major betrayal, but by countless small distortions repeated over time. Later that evening, Michael apologized. Not with dramatic speeches or emotional promises. Just simple honesty. He admitted he should have listened sooner. He admitted he had accepted claims without verification. He admitted he had allowed doubt to replace trust. As I listened, I appreciated his sincerity. Yet something inside me remained cautious. The truth was finally visible. The lies had finally collapsed. But understanding what happened and repairing the damage were two very different things. And as I looked across the table at the man I had loved for nearly 2 decades, I realized we were both about to discover whether some wounds heal completely or simply become lessons that stay with you forever. The weeks that followed were quieter than any period I could remember during our marriage. Not because every problem had been solved. Not because the pain had disappeared. The quiet came from finally living in reality instead of confusion. For the first time in a very long time, I no longer questioned what had happened. The truth was no longer hidden behind assumptions or filtered through someone else's version of events. It simply existed, clear and undeniable. Michael worked hard to rebuild what had been damaged. He became more present, more thoughtful. Most importantly, he began listening before reaching conclusions. I could see the effort he was making, and I respected it. Yet healing is not a switch that can be flipped overnight. Trust grows slowly, and once broken, it requires patience to restore. One afternoon, several weeks after his conversation with Patricia, we took a walk through a nearby park. The trees were full of spring leaves, and families gathered around picnic tables while children played in the distance. As we walked along the trail, Michael finally spoke about something he had been carrying for months. "I keep thinking about how many times you tried to tell me something was wrong," he said, "and how many times I dismissed it." His voice carried genuine regret. I looked ahead at the path stretching through the park. "You trusted the wrong person," I said gently. Michael shook his head. "No, I stopped trusting the right person." The honesty of that statement stayed with me long after the conversation ended. A few days later, Patricia called and asked if she could meet with me privately. I spent a long time considering whether to accept. Eventually, I agreed. We met at a small coffee shop on a quiet weekday morning. For several moments after sitting down, neither of us spoke. The confident certainty she once carried seemed diminished. Finally, she apologized. Not with excuses. Not with explanations. Just an apology. She admitted that she had convinced herself she was protecting her son. Along the way, she stopped seeing the damage she was causing. I listened carefully. Then I thanked her for being honest. Forgiveness did not arrive all at once, but something important happened during that conversation. The burden I had carried for so long finally felt lighter. Months earlier, I believed I needed everyone to understand my side of the story before I could move forward. I was wrong. What I truly needed was to stop defining myself through other people's opinions. By the beginning of summer, life felt different. Not perfect, not magically repaired, simply healthier. The tension that once dominated every family gathering had faded. Michael and I continued rebuilding trust one day at a time. Patricia worked to repair relationships that had been damaged by years of assumptions and interference. As for me, I carried an important lesson from the experience. The greatest danger was never the lies themselves. It was allowing those lies to replace direct communication, trust, and common sense. Looking back now, I understand that the truth did not save my marriage by itself. The truth simply opened a door. What saved us was the willingness to finally face it. And sometimes, that willingness changes everything.